Second chances. Chapter 12.
Upon their initial sighting of Sherry's ship, Captain Stevens had sent continuous reports to the System Navy. They had reported the initial findings about the planet, the methods of investigation, and their conclusions. Yet, for some unknown reason, they had not received a response from the System Navy. Nevertheless, every aspect of the investigation and conclusions were reported faithfully. Commander Slater led another landing party to investigate the underground areas that had been charted. During their investigation, the landing party found a large number of dead. Dr. Mtau led a medical team to investigate the causes of death and found that the people had died of nerve gas and radiation poisoning. During the time the Constitution spent investigating the destruction of Alteris, the result of every scan was painstakingly analyzed. Every point on the planet where there might be some doubt as to the finality of the data was checked and double-checked. No single scan or study was taken at face value. Instead, data was analyzed and reanalyzed to be absolutely certain that there was no margin for error. Ultimately, all investigations concluded that no life remained on the planet. It had been murdered. Not a single life form remained on the devastated planet. Sherry spent every waking hour working beside the officers and crew of the ship as they sorted and analyzed data. Then she spent many more hours poring over the various reports hoping to find something. However, the conclusion was that a spacefaring race of unknown origin had eradicated all life on Alteris. Commander Slater and her landing party found many underground archives, libraries, museums, and storage areas. Recordings were made of everything they found. Optical and audio scans were preserved. Objects of art and society were photographed with high-resolution equipment. Both 2- and 3-dimensional recordings were made of every single artifact. All these records were carefully documented and stored in the ship's computer system. And as many hard copies of these records as possible were made and stored in several unoccupied staterooms aboard the ship. The original documents and artifacts were carefully replaced in their original cases and cabinets. Films and tapes were carefully copied and returned for preservation. Secondary scans and laboratory analysis of the destruction were as carefully pored over as was the search for life. Close examination and inspection of debris from every corner of the planet was scrutinized for evidence of weapon types and characteristics. Every attribute, every dimension, and every peculiarity of the weaponry was compiled and analyzed, checked, and double-checked to ensure accuracy and completeness. David began recording his report to the System Navy. Carefully documenting every aspect of their investigation, he covered the initial contact with Sherry and a thorough report of the technical properties of Sherry's ship. His report continued to cover the methodology used in their investigations. The conclusion was that, except for their passenger, the planet Alteris had been completely razed. He went on to provide every technical detail about the weapons used and the conclusion the crew had arrived at, that the system had never come into contact with the race responsible for this act of genocide. David included in his report as much of the archaeological material as he felt was appropriate and a recommendation that an archaeological team be brought to Alteris to learn everything they can about Sherry's people. His recommendation was as strongly worded as he could put it, that it would be a crime against the universe to allow the memory of Sherry's people to disappear. He took his final report down to the VIP suite and asked Admiral Halloran to read it and critique it before it was sent to the System Navy. Halloran read over the report. There was nothing in the report that he did not already know since he had been included in every briefing and discussion concerning Alteris. Tim stood beside Sherry as she pored over data and reports. He looked up from the report and nodded to David.
This is as thorough a report as I have ever seen, Dave. I can't think of anything you have left out or anything that should be deleted or changed. Send it.
As time wore on, several couples approached the captain about getting married. David asked each couple when and how they knew they wanted to marry. Over and over again, the story was the same. First, Sherry had touched them, and afterward, they realized that they were in love with another member of the crew and wished to make that lifetime commitment. Within the several months that the investigation of Alteris was carried out, 17 couples requested and were married. At the beginning of the second shift on the 60th day of the investigation, as David was going to his quarters, Dr. T. Vass and Commander Sorrell stopped him and requested to be married. David regarded the two Hephaestusans, that makes 18. Is there a special ceremony you would like performed? T. Vass and Sorrell looked at each other and replied,
No, the standard ceremony will do quite nicely, Captain. Then, when we have the opportunity to return to Hephaestusia, We will contact our families and arrange a traditional Hephaestion wedding ceremony.
As they stood discussing the wedding, Admiral Halloran and Sherry approached. The three officers stopped and rendered due respect to the Admiral. Halloran put his arm around Sherry's waist and spoke.
Captain, since you are discussing the wedding, Sherry and I would request that you marry us as well.
David remarked, "That's 19. For both couples, of course, it would be my pleasure to conduct the ceremonies for you." T. Bass and Sorrel said.
We would be honored if we could make this a double wedding.
Halloran and Sherry agreed, and the ceremony was set for 1800 hours, 2 days hence. On the set day at 1800 hours, the crew assembled in the rec room to celebrate another wedding ceremony. Admiral Halloran and Sorrel were handsomely attired in their dress uniforms. The two brides were beautifully adorned. Sherry wore a multicolored gown that perfectly set off her feminine charms, and T. Vass in traditional Hephaestion wedding garb. At the end of the day, David sat in his quarters, reflecting on the events of the past 2 months, especially the coupling of the various members of his crew. He had to admit that the ship was running smoothly and efficiently. The crew had become a little quieter and more prone to be at peace with themselves and others. But, envying them, there was no peace in his soul, only empty loneliness. A pain arose in his chest as he thought about Phyllis and Stella. He knew the motivation that drove Halloran to reach out for a little happiness, a little joy, just one more time. Well, the crew had done an excellent job analyzing the planet and its destruction. It was time to begin their investigation of this sector to find the race responsible for this atrocity. He tapped his comm badge, Stevens to bridge.
Bridge, Lieutenant Jensen, sir.
Ship wide please, Lieutenant.
Ship wide, sir. Go ahead.
Now hear this, this is the captain. In the absence of orders to the contrary, this ship will begin an investigation of this sector at 0800 hours tomorrow. All sections are to be fully staffed and prepared to investigate and map this sector properly. All senior officers and section chiefs will meet in the conference room at 0700 hours. Captain out. 0700 hours the following day, the senior officers had gathered in the conference room to outline a strategy for investigating the sector. As David spoke, the ship's comm interrupted him.
Captain, this is Lieutenant Jensen. I have been told that the science station may have found evidence of life on the planet.
Captain Stevens started for the door. All right people, we have something more important that needs our attention. Slater, you have the con. I'll be there as soon as I attend to a couple of other matters. Find out what's going on. Beverly Slater sprang for the door.
Aye, sir. Let's go, people. Bridge, shipwide, please.
Ship-wide, Commander.
Now hear this. This is the first officer. We have signs of life on the planet. All duty personnel on station. Stand by. First officer out.
David walked to the VIP quarters and thumbed the signal. On being invited in, he entered and told Admiral Halloran and Sherry that the science station had found a strong indication that life was still on the planet. The three stepped out the door and headed to the personnel lift. In the lift, David ordered, "Sick bay." He explained that he wanted to visit John Self to see how well he was healing and to tell him that there might be life on the planet after all. The lift stopped, and David exited. Admiral Halloran and Sherry continued to the bridge. David walked to sick bay, where he saw that John was the only patient. He stepped over to where John was resting. T. Vass were close by, so David asked her about John's progress. She turned and told the captain that John was doing quite well. However, he had taken the skin grafts well, and it would only be weeks before he could begin to serve a limited duty schedule. David thanked the doctor and, turning to John, told him about the news of the possibility of there being life on the planet.
How can that be? We checked everything, and we found nothing.
John, I don't know. But I'll let you know when I find out. I'm glad to hear you're doing well. I'll see you later. And he walked out and headed to the personnel lift. On the bridge, David noted that Jenny Olsen was still on the bridge at the science station. "Jenny, what have you found?" Without turning, Jenny replied.
Captain, while on watch, I was jolted by a thought. We had never done a deep scan under the polar ice cap. So, I thought I would do one. I have found something under the ice cap that is a lot like Sherry's ship. We can't penetrate the object with our sensors and get a fix on it with the teleporter. I think it warrants further investigation.
Well, if we can't survey it from here, We will have to go down and do the job. Sherry, is it an undersea habitat?
I don't know. I've never heard of one.
Well, we just have to look and see. Commander Slater chose a shuttle crew and check it out. We will need a visual inspection of the object. We can make better plans for our investigation when we have more information. Slater selected her shuttle crew and left the bridge for the shuttle bay. Upon reaching the shuttle bay, O'Reilly told her that the shuttle was ready for her use, twice the usual load of fuel, oxygen, food, and water.
Just a precaution, lass.
The team boarded the shuttle and departed the Constitution. Shortly the shuttle was in 30 fathoms of water and beginning to move under the ice cap. After 30 minutes, the crew could see a large object in front of them. The object had the same elusive silver shimmer that Sherry's ship had. Slater began to record the images they saw while transmitting them to the Constitution. They saw from a distance a long column reaching from the sea floor to about their level with a great sphere sitting on the column. They continued to survey the structure. Finally, about 60 fathoms down on the column, they found what looked like an opening. Zooming in on the area around the opening, they found controls like those next to the airlock on Sherry's ship. Having ascertained this information, Commander Slater called the ship and asked for instructions. David told her to hold her position while he, Sherry, and the Admiral discussed it. Admiral, I don't think we can just walk in. We are going to have Sherry go with us. She speaks the language, and she is one of them. So I want to be as cautious as possible. After a short discussion, this seemed to be the best solution to a sticky situation. Stevens ordered Slater to return for Sherry, who would try to make first contact. Meticulous measurements were made of the opening on the habitat. Then, Captain O'Reilly and his engineering crew set about to modify the shuttle so that it could dock with the opening without having to adapt to the pressure of 60 fathoms of water. Meanwhile, Commander Slater, her crew, and Sherry prepared for their next dive. Commander Slater, her crew, and Sherry reached the habitat at about 12:30 hours. They immediately accomplished the docking procedure and set about to open the entrance to the habitat. Having opened the entry, Sherry and Slater looked into the habitat. There they saw a city, and on the entry platform stood several men who appeared to challenge the women. Slater opened her comm unit to the Constitution and allowed the ship's computer to translate the conversation as it happened. The men challenged them. But she did not receive any translation in return. Commander Slater asked Sherry,
Are these people speaking the language of your planet?
Yes, they asked who we are and what we are doing here.
Slater to Constitution, can you hear me?
No answer was returned.
Well, I guess you will have to be our translator until we can get a patch to the ship.
Sherry turned to the men and spoke in her native language.
I told them that our planet had been attacked, and I was the only person to survive. Then we found this place and came to see how many survivors there are.
Sherry continued, then translated.
These people are from the United System some 200 light years toward the galactic rim. This is Commander Slater, the first officer of the USS Constitution. These good people rescued me in space and have been trying to find out who destroyed our planet.
The men replied, and she translated.
They are asking what we want of them.
Slater replied,
Tell them there is no life except them on this entire planet. Do they understand that there is no life?
Sherry translated and then translated their reply.
They said that they will simply stay here and, maybe someday, try to reclaim the surface.
Slater said,
Ask them what they eat.
They said the sea supplies everything they need. They have no need of anything from the surface.
I guess they don't understand. The sea is dead. There is no life on this planet.
Sherry spoke to the men once more, and they were visibly shaken. There came, then, a cacophony of words from the men. Sherry finally had to shout to get their attention. She asked them to step aboard the shuttle so that they could be transported to the orbiting ship to speak directly with the representatives of the system. The men resisted, saying they were only minor officials. The people who needed to speak with the system would be their higher leaders. It was finally decided that these men would communicate the facts and needs to their leaders. Sherry and the others would have to wait. Commander Slater and Sherry decided to wait in the shuttle. They remained docked with the habitat but stepped back into the shuttle and took their seats. Slater reached for the subspace transceiver and called the bridge of the Constitution, and explained the situation to the captain. The shuttle crew waited for 4 hours before the leaders of the habitat finally stepped up to the lock of the shuttle. Then, finally, Sherry invited the leaders into the shuttle. But they were reluctant to travel into space. Commander Slater proposed a compromise. The Constitution would set up an airtight shelter on the surface. The captain and perhaps Admiral Halloran would come down if the habitat leaders would go up. This seemed to satisfy the leaders, therefore, a date and time was established for the shuttle to return to the habitat. Then they would transport the leaders to the shelter on the surface, where they would meet with the representatives of the system. Commander Slater and her crew cleared an area in the most favorable environment possible and set up a Carlson shelter. At the appointed time, the leaders of the Alteris underwater habitat were brought to the shelter, and Captain Stevens and Admiral Halloran were teleported down to the shelter. In the shelter, a conference table and the necessary audiovisual equipment were set up. Sherry made the introductions.
Leaders Melvow and Serical, this is Admiral Timothy Halloran and Captain David Stevens of the United System. Admiral Halloran, Captain Stevens, this is Leader Melvow and Leader Serical of the underwater habitat of Alteris.
The men greeted one another, and then David spoke. Gentlemen, leaders, your planet has been murdered by an unknown spacefaring race. We despaired of finding any life on your world until we detected your underwater habitat. And now, we are here in an effort to help you. Leader Melvow spoke.
We have seen the destruction, and do not doubt your word about the extent of the carnage. But how can we be sure you are not the ones who murdered our planet?
Leader, you have in Sherry one of your own people who was an eyewitness to some of the devastation and had a glimpse of the shape of the perpetrator's ships. But, other than the word of one person, you have only our assurance that we are not the destroyers and abhor this crime as much as you do.
I just don't know.
Leader Melvow looked at Leader Serical, and they both sat in silence for a long time. Then Leader Serical spoke.
Melvow, we really have little choice. If we do not accept help from these people, we will die.
Leader Melvow spoke.
We understand that there is no life in the air, nor the ground, nor is there life in the sea. Is this correct?
Leader, we have spent the last 60 days investigating the destruction of your world. We have checked and rechecked our data and can find no life except your habitat.
Captain, we depend upon the sea for our food. If the sea is dead, what can we do?
Sir, we need to know how many people there are in the habitat and what resources you have. Leader Serical turned to David.
We have 2,000 people in the habitat. It would be best if you and my people could get together and share our knowledge.
Admiral Halloran spoke up.
We have a communications problem. There is something about your habitat that blocks our communications devices. Without being able to communicate with our ship, we would have no way to talk to one another except for the very limited knowledge of our language that Sherry has.
Admiral, we have a field that supplies strength to our habitat. However, the field may prevent you from communicating. Perhaps your technical people and ours can find a way to enable adequate communications.
Admiral, leaders, perhaps it would be best to contact our technical experts, bring them here, and let them work it out. I'm sure Abels and their technicians will be able to work out a relay that will work just fine. Commander Slater and her landing party had been doing security duty during the conference. After several hours, David called Slater and asked her to take the leaders back to the habitat and then return to the ship. David told her that Commander Sorrell would take charge of another landing party to assist in communications with the Alteris. On the bridge, Admiral Halloran and Captain Stevens went into the captain's ready room.
Dave, I should contact Darien and apprise him of our situation. May I use your subspace comm?
Of course, Admiral. Here, sit at the desk.
Lieutenant Jensen, this is Admiral Halloran.
Yes, sir.
How long should a subspace message take to reach Naval Base 13?
Sir, it should take about 20 minutes.
Then prepare to send to Naval Base 13, Admiral Halloran's compliments to Commodore Clausen. Jerry, please forward this message to Admiral Marovich and reply when you have received the Admiral's acknowledgement of receipt. Thanks, Tim. Report follows.
Sir, Lieutenant Jensen, the message has been sent. Shall I notify you of any reply?
Yes, thank you, Lieutenant.
That was that. Now to wait. Wait for Marovich's reply. Wait for the communications with the people in the habitat to be completed. Wait for information and plans to help these people survive. Work went on. Abels established a link between the inside of the habitat and the dock shuttle, which became a relay for all communications between the Alteris and the Constitution. As soon as the communications were established, Commander Sorrell set his landing party to gather the information needed by the System Navy and the Constitution to help them survive. They found that the laboratories in the habitat had representative samples of every marine creature, organism, plant, and bacteria. Lieutenant Joel Carson, the ship's life sciences officer, was pressed into service to analyze the seas to find out what measures would be needed to make the waters habitable to marine life. In addition, his entire section was tasked with investigating the possibilities of cloning the myriad of living creatures that once inhabited the planet's seas. Captain Stevens and Admiral Halloran sat in the ready room, waiting to hear from Admiral Maravich. They quietly talked about the problem of the Prime Directive and helping the Alteris survive. Then, it came down to the question of giving the Alteris replicator technology or allowing them to die. Suddenly the comm sounded.
Admiral Halloran, this is Lieutenant Jensen. We have a reply from Naval Base 13.
Let's have it, Lieutenant.
Aye aye, sir. Commodore Clausen sends his compliments to Admiral Halloran. Sir, I have done as you asked. I relayed your message and report to Admiral Maravich, including his reply.
Tim and David scrutinized the reply and found that Admiral Maravich had taken action to commission a humanitarian mission to Alteris. The mission would include 4 heavy cruisers, 2 science vessels, and 3 cargo ships loaded with supplies. The Planetology Division of the System Navy was sending 13 planetologists. The System Commission on Agriculture would provide 6 agriculturists, and so on. It seemed that Darien had taken all appropriate action to assist the Alteris. The last lines in his message read, "The USS Constitution will remain on station at Alteris until the mission arrives at Alteris." Upon his arrival, Commodore Mendez of the USS Valiant will assume operational control of the mission. Captain USS Constitution will provide all assistance to Commodore Mendez and his mission. 30 days after the mission's arrival, the USS Constitution will be released to return to Naval Base 13. Captain Stevens will sit before a board of inquiry to be convened at Naval Base 13 to answer charges of dereliction of duty. Charges and specifications will be forwarded under separate cover. Darien Maravich, Admiral, Commander-in-Chief. Admiral Halloran told David not to be too concerned. He witnessed every action during this mission and would testify on his behalf. David wondered what charges could be brought up against him. Well, the only thing to do was, again, wait. Commodore Mendez and his mission started arriving about 6 days after Admiral Maravich's reply. Mendez was a hard-nosed commander who arrived trying to assume command authority over the Constitution and her crew. Admiral Halloran would not allow him to assume command authority over David or the Constitution. Halloran confronted Mendez and told him that he was much like his grandfather.
I knew your grandfather, Commodore Mendez. I respected him as a man and an officer. You had better calm down, or I will relieve you before you get started. I hope I have made myself clear, Commodore.
Yes, sir. Quite clear.
After that, things quieted down, and the mission started to work with the Alteris and help them rebuild their planet, culture, and civilization. The Commodore began to work quietly and effectively with the mission elements, the Alteris, and the Constitution. David gave Commodore Mendez and his mission specialists every bit of data collected during their investigation of the catastrophe. David also provided all the data that had been collected on the perpetrators. At the end of the 30 days, David reported to the Commodore that the Constitution would be on its way to Naval Base 13. He asked Commodore Mendez if he knew the charges against him. Mendez admitted that he did not. No one in the mission knew. Repeated requests for information from the System Navy and Naval Base 13 got no response. And so, the Constitution broke orbit and headed for Naval Base 13. As they began to move away, Commodore Mendez called.
Constitution, calm seas and fair winds.
David replied, calm seas. It was 6 days to the naval base, and David had difficulty sleeping the entire trip. By the time the Constitution reached Naval Base 13, the ship's crew had 31 married couples. Their joy did little to relieve David of his anxiety. Upon reaching the naval base, the ship received the following message: Commodore Clausen's compliments to Admiral Halloran and Captain Stevens. Please join me in my office at 1900 hours.